Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
My mother raised her wine glass high above the flickering centerpiece candles, her voice trembling with performative pride as she toasted to what she called Travis's new chapter, a phrase so theatrical it could have belonged in a soap opera. Her tone layered with syrupy adoration while her eyes danced across the table, landing on me like I was a pit stop, on the way to more important scenery, a bench warmer in the wrong uniform. To Travis, she declared, drawing out the vowels like she was introducing royalty. For his engagement, his promotion, his beautiful new home, the table burst into polite applause. Forks paused mid-motion, and Sabrina, his fiancée, flashed the kind of stiff smile women wear when they're not sure whether they've stepped into a fairy tale or a slow-moving nightmare. I raised my water glass, not that anyone noticed, and watched as everyone drank in the fantasy. And then, like always, she turned to me. My mother's smile shifted, the celebration momentarily interrupted by the minor inconvenience of my presence. "And Emma," she began, dragging the vowels again, but this time with that tone, the one that says she's winding up for a punchline no one asked for. "Still renting, right?" She didn't even laugh at her own joke. She just let it hang there, oily and smug, while everyone else looked anywhere but at me. Even Travis, who had once spent an entire summer using my Netflix password without asking, had the nerve to smirk into his mashed potatoes. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I didn't pick up my napkin and storm out like the Emma they all remembered. 20-something, tired, raw, trying to claw her way up from nothing and getting lectures about gratitude in return. No, I just smiled. Not the kind of smile that invites warmth or resolution, but the kind that stops conversations cold and makes people replay the moment later in the car ride home. I leaned forward just slightly, enough to make her lean back, and said, "Actually, I've owned for years. I just don't invite people who underestimate me." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the ice crack inside someone's glass. Sabrina looked down. Travis stopped chewing. My uncle coughed, possibly to break the tension, or maybe because he'd inhaled a green bean the wrong way. I didn't care. I let the moment marinate. The thing is, they never asked. Not once. No one had ever said, "Hey Emma, how's work?" or "Where are you living these days?" Because the family mythology had already been written years ago, and in it, I was the character who never quite made it out of the first act. The one who took too long to graduate, who didn't get married, who had potential that was always being discussed like it was a stubborn plant that wouldn't bloom. When Travis dropped out of business school after a year and started calling himself a founder, they bought him a new laptop and threw him a party. When I finally paid off my grad school loans and got promoted to senior legal analyst, my mother sent a thumbs-up emoji and said she thought I'd always be good with documents. But that night, everything shifted. Not because I suddenly mattered more, but because they realized they hadn't been paying attention, and I was no longer the kind of person who would tolerate being underestimated for sport. My mother blinked, her lips pressing into a line that used to mean enough sass, but now just looked like confusion. Travis made a little noise like he was about to speak, but didn't. Maybe he saw something in my face he hadn't seen before. Maybe he knew, in that moment, that he was no longer the only one holding cards at the table. After dinner, while the others shuffled into the living room to drink too much wine and rewatch old family videos that conveniently skipped every moment I wasn't shining, I stayed back to clear the plates. Sabrina lingered, hovering behind me like she wanted to help but didn't know how to ask. She finally said, "That thing you said about owning?" Her voice was tentative but curious. I nodded, kept scraping stuffing into the trash. "That's real, eh?" she asked. I turned, finally meeting her eyes, and said, "Every square meter." She hesitated, looked toward the living room, then back at me, lowering her voice. "Can we talk? Tonight?" I didn't answer right away. I just dried my hands, tossed the towel over my shoulder, and stared at her long enough for her to look away. "Sure," I said finally, but my tone was different now. Measured, deliberate, a woman already 15 steps into a strategy no one saw coming. Because what they didn't know, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was that I'd been building something for years. Quietly, patiently, with every insult and backhanded compliment, every family dinner where I was expected to clap for someone else's mediocrity, I'd been laying foundations. Legal ones, financial ones, psychological ones. I didn't need to scream or break down or force their respect. All I had to do was wait. And now that the waiting was over, I wasn't here to make peace. I was here to make them watch, and they had no idea what was coming. Later that night, after the last piece of pumpkin pie had been poked at and mostly left behind, after the children had been herded upstairs with iPads and soft warnings not to wake Grandpa, and after my mother had disappeared into the laundry room under the pretense of sorting towels, likely to avoid eye contact with me, I sat alone in my car, letting the heater hum gently around my legs, the engine idling, headlights off. I wasn't ready to leave yet, not because I felt any nostalgia for the house or the people in it, but because I wanted to absorb what had just happened, to let the silence of my private little space contrast against the artificial warmth I'd just endured for hours. Then, through the fogged passenger window, I saw movement. Hesitant, graceful, almost guilty. It was Sabrina. She approached like someone unsure of the role she was about to play. Someone who knew stepping into this car might change the script she'd been rehearsing since she agreed to marry into our mess. She knocked once, quickly, then opened the door before I could answer and slid into the passenger seat with the kind of nervous energy that comes from holding back too many things for too long. "Sorry," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as though she needed to clear her face before clearing her conscience. I needed to ask you something I can't ask anyone else." I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The quiet between us was heavy enough to make her earn the next part. And to her credit, she did. She took a breath. One of those breaths where you can see a person gearing up to betray someone else's secrets, not out of malice, but out of sheer survival. And then she said it. "How well do you know Travis's business?" It was such an innocent-sounding question, dressed in softness and hesitation, but beneath it was something sharp and undeniable. I turned to face her fully now, one arm resting on the steering wheel, the other in my lap, and replied with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment far more times than she'd admit. "Probably better than he thinks I do." That was all the invitation she needed. She began talking quickly, as if afraid she'd lose her nerve if she didn't unload it all at once. She told me how he'd been hiding bank statements, how she'd caught glimpses of emails from investors that didn't match what he was saying over dinner, how he'd borrowed money from one of her cousins just until Series B closes, and how he'd once said, during a late-night phone call he thought she was asleep through, that he was glad I never showed up to family events too much, because I sucked the air out of the room when people realized she was the smart one. Sabrina wasn't just venting. She was asking for validation, for proof she wasn't the only one seeing through the polished shell of the man everyone else called brilliant. And while I wanted to tell her that she deserved better, that she didn't need to marry into a house built on noise and ego and fragile illusions, I also knew something she didn't. Travis's startup, this grand beacon of his self-worth, wasn't just failing. It didn't even exist the way he said it did. 2 years ago, I bought a building in the city through a holding company under a different name, not because I needed the income, but because the location was perfect and the zoning rights were generous. Last year, I discovered, by sheer coincidence at first, that Travis had listed the address of that building as the headquarters for his app company. He had never asked, never checked, never once considered that I might own something that could complicate his story. He'd used photos from the public listing site to pitch to investors. He'd even created a fake office interior in Photoshop, adding glass walls and high-tech desks that didn't exist. It was all show, all noise. And I had the receipts. So when Sabrina said, "I think he's lying to people who trusted him," I didn't have to guess. I already knew. I'd been quietly watching him build a house of cards on a foundation I owned. And now he had no idea I'd seen every angle of the structure from beneath, waiting for the right moment to tap just the right card. "He's not who you think he is," I said finally, and she flinched, not because she didn't believe me, but because she already knew that and hated herself for needing it confirmed. But you don't need to expose him, I added. He'll do it himself. All we have to do is give him a stage. She looked at me, surprised, not just by my calmness, but by my clarity. And maybe, somewhere under all that fear, she was relieved to see someone who wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. I told her I'd call her in a few days. She nodded, thanked me, and got out of the car with the heavy steps of someone who suddenly realized they were walking towards a cliff instead of a chapel. I watched her disappear into the darkness, then pulled out my phone and opened a folder of screenshots, legal filings, tax documents, and architectural photos. I scrolled past them slowly, not to study them, because I knew them by heart, but to remind myself just how many steps ahead I was. What they never understood, what they still didn't grasp, even now, is that I never wanted their praise. I never needed their approval. All I wanted was to be underestimated long enough to build something they couldn't see until it was too late. And as it turned out, my brother had just handed me the perfect opportunity. When the email invite went out 2 weeks later, dressed up as a casual celebration for a friend's milestone, with no names, no explanations, just an address and a line that read, "Rooftop dress warm," I knew exactly what I was doing and exactly what reactions it would provoke, because for years I had watched my family interpret vagueness as invitation and subtlety as weakness. And this time, I was giving them just enough rope to hang their assumptions with. I didn't say whose birthday it was. I didn't say whose rooftop. I just sent it to the family group thread. Yes, the same one where I was usually ignored unless someone wanted legal help or directions to a venue, and waited to see who would take the bait. Travis replied first, of course, in that half-ironic, half-insecure tone he always used when he wasn't sure whether he was being included sincerely or as an afterthought. "Nice of you to remember I exist," he wrote, which was rich coming from someone who once forgot my birthday entirely and tried to cover it by Venmoing me $20 with a cake emoji. Sabrina responded 5 minutes later with a thumbs up. My mother didn't say anything for a day and a half, then wrote, "Sounds interesting. Do we know this person?" Which was her polite way of fishing for control, of trying to position herself as the organizer of whatever was about to happen. I ignored her, just like she taught me to do, and let the silence answer for me. The night of the party, the sky was clear and sharp with late winter cold, the kind that makes your breath look like smoke and your nose sting even before you get out of the car. I had reserved valet for everyone, not because I cared about their comfort, but because I wanted to control the timing of their arrival. I wore a dark green coat over a navy suit, subtle jewelry, and heels that made the rooftop floor click in a way that drew attention without demanding it. My assistant, yes, the one no one in my family knew existed, handled check-in downstairs, politely collecting names and coats while confirming that the building was privately owned. No one connected the dots. Why would they? Emma was still the one who rented, after all. They arrived in clusters, Travis and Sabrina first, both wearing the kind of curated, casual outfits people choose when they're hoping to look wealthy without seeming like they're trying too hard. My mother and stepfather next. Him grumbling about parking even though he hadn't driven himself anywhere in over a decade. My aunt and uncle, 2 cousins, and a few obligatory plus ones who kept glancing around the space like they were waiting to see someone famous. The rooftop had been transformed. String lights above, soft jazz playing low enough to feel expensive, a bar staffed by actual professionals, and a view of the skyline that made everyone instinctively pull out their phones, as if capturing the moment might grant them ownership over it. But it wasn't until halfway through the evening, after the second round of cocktails and small talk that barely skimmed the surface of anything meaningful, that my mother finally leaned over to me and asked, in a voice that tried and failed to sound curious rather than cautious, "So, whose birthday is this again?" I smiled, not wide, not fake, just enough to let her feel it in her ribs. "Mine," I said, as if that should have been obvious. She blinked, caught somewhere between confusion and insult. You never said anything, Hakun, she murmured, already calculating the narrative in her head. You never asked, I replied, sipping my drink without looking at her again. Travis, meanwhile, had been chatting with one of the developers I invited, a woman named Kira, who had recently rejected his app proposal without even responding to his follow-up email. He didn't know who she was at first. He only saw a pretty woman in a tailored coat who knew how to talk numbers. But as soon as she mentioned the property address he'd used in his pitch deck, his face lost a shade. He turned to look at me, eyes narrowing like he was finally beginning to feel the walls shift. Emma, he said, stepping closer. What is this building? I didn't answer directly. I just raised my glass toward the far wall, where a small plaque had been mounted near the elevator, sleek, modern, etched in gold, and on it the name of the holding company. His eyes followed, and the moment his lips began to form the name, realization struck with such visible force, I could almost hear the click of his illusion shattering. You own this? He asked, not even trying to hide the desperation. This whole place? I didn't bother with sarcasm or smugness. I didn't need to rub it in. The truth was doing all the work for me. I've owned it for nearly 2 years, I said simply. Didn't realize you were using it as a backdrop for your LinkedIn fantasy, until a friend flagged it. He went pale. Sabrina was watching him now, quiet and tight-lipped. My mother's mouth opened slightly, then closed again like she wasn't sure which version of me to believe. Her rental daughter or this woman standing in front of her with the keys to a $10 million rooftop. But the best moment, the one I'd replay later, when I'd wonder if I'd gone too far or just far enough, came when one of Travis's potential investors, a man named Victor, who happened to also be one of my clients, came over, shook my hand, and said with casual ease, You never told me this was yours. No wonder the zoning permits were so clean. Travis looked like he'd been punched in the throat. I turned back to the bar, gestured for another glass of wine, and said to no one in particular, Funny how people assume the quiet ones don't own anything. They didn't leave right away. That would have been too obvious. But the tone shifted completely, like a party where everyone suddenly realizes they've been dressed for the wrong occasion. My mother pretended to be tired. Travis faked a phone call. Sabrina said nothing at all. And when the elevator doors finally closed behind them, I let myself breathe for the first time in hours. I didn't throw that party for revenge. I threw it because I wanted to see what truth looked like when placed under warm lights and expensive glassware, surrounded by people who only ever saw me through the lens of their assumptions. And that night, for the first time in years, I saw the truth staring back. When Travis showed up at my office 3 days later, unannounced, overdressed, and visibly rattled, I knew before he even opened his mouth that whatever facade he had been clinging to since the rooftop party had begun to slip in places he could no longer duct tape shut. He stood in the doorway of my glass-walled corner office like a man who had prepared for a speech but forgotten the first line, trying to rearrange his features into something halfway between offended and charming, though his eyes betrayed him long before his mouth could form a sentence. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't rise from my desk. I just folded my hands in front of me, tilted my head slightly, and said, You must be here about the plaque. His laugh, short, humorless, too sharp at the edges, was the kind that made interns in the hallway pause and glance nervously before pretending to be busy with something irrelevant. You think that was funny? He asked, walking farther into the room without waiting to be invited. That little stunt on the roof? I leaned back in my chair, not to signal comfort, but to give him space to walk directly into the trap he had built for himself, brick by oblivious brick. I didn't think it was funny, I said, watching his movements with clinical detachment. I thought it was overdue. For a moment, he didn't respond, just stood there shifting his weight like someone deciding whether to posture or plead. Then with a huff that told me he had chosen the former, at least for now, he pulled a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket and tossed it onto my desk. You sent this to Sabrina, he said, as though the act itself was a betrayal more serious than anything he had ever done to her. I picked it up without urgency, unfolded it slowly, and looked down at the lease agreement he'd forged months ago, complete with a fake landlord's signature and my building's address listed as the headquarters for a startup that had never existed beyond his pitch deck and a few Canva mock-ups. Actually, I corrected, placing the paper gently back on the desk, as if it were fragile and unworthy of further handling. I sent that to myself years ago when I first saw it floating around your investor update emails. I paused, letting the silence fill the room like smoke. Sabrina just happened to be curious enough to ask what it was. He didn't respond, and for the first time since he walked in, I saw the mask of confidence begin to crack. Not in an obvious way, but in the slight tremble of his jaw, the darting of his eyes as they searched for an escape route in a room that had no windows left open. "You're not going to do anything with that," he said, though the tone had shifted from accusation to hope. "You wouldn't." "You're right," I said, opening a drawer and pulling out a thick, sealed envelope, which I placed next to the forged lease like an exhibit in a courtroom that had no need for a judge. "I won't, but I did give someone else the option." He reached for the envelope instinctively, but I placed my hand on it before he could touch it, locking eyes with him in a way that made it clear this conversation was no longer a sibling spat, no longer an argument about dinner tables and family dynamics, and whose name got mentioned in Christmas letters. This was about ownership. This was about consequence. "Inside," I said, tapping the envelope once slowly, "is the title deed to this building, the one you lied about controlling, signed under a shell company that can be traced directly to me. Also inside are timestamped screenshots of your pitch decks, copies of emails you sent with falsified documentation, and a list of the angel investors who've contacted me since last Friday, asking if the rumors were true." His face went pale then, not dramatically, not in a way that would make a stranger ask if he needed water, but in the quiet, creeping way that tells you someone has just realized how much deeper the hole is than they thought. "You're bluffing," he muttered, but it was too late for denial to land properly, and we both knew it. This could ruin me," I nodded, not out of malice, but because truth doesn't need dramatics to be effective. "It could," I agreed, folding my hands again. "Or you could take the option I left on the table." He swallowed hard, his mouth working to form a question he didn't know how to phrase. I helped him. "You tell the truth," I said plainly. "You go to Mom, to the family, to your investors. You tell them what you did, how you got carried away, how you thought the story mattered more than the facts. You own the lie." He stared at me like I had asked him to carve out a piece of his own reputation with a spoon. "Why?" he whispered, voice cracking now, under the weight of the choice I had placed in his hands. "Why not just destroy me?" I paused, genuinely considering the question for a moment, then replied with the kind of calm that only comes from having nothing left to prove. "Because if I do it, it's revenge. But if you do it, it's failure. And failure's a lot harder to recover from when you have to say it out loud." He left without the envelope. He left without any of the bluster he arrived with. His shoulders hunched in a way that reminded me not of a man who had been caught, but of a boy who'd finally realized no one else was coming to clean up the mess. I watched him walk down the hallway through the glass, saw Sabrina waiting in the lobby below, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She didn't wave. I stayed in my office long after they were gone, staring out at the skyline that had once felt so distant, so inaccessible, when I was 23 and drowning in rent I could barely afford, when I was filing paperwork for people like Travis, who wore expensive watches and knew how to sell ideas that never made it past their whiteboards. I stayed until the sun dipped below the buildings and the lights in the neighboring windows began to flicker on, one by one, until the city looked like a circuit board blinking under glass. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in. I felt like I'd built the circuit myself, and I was just beginning to flip the switches. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived, wrapped in that particular kind of stillness that only occurs when the world has collectively agreed to pretend, if only for a few hours, that everything is peaceful, everything is resolved, Everything is exactly as it should be, and I found myself staring out the kitchen window of my townhouse, watching flurries trace invisible patterns in the air, sipping coffee from a mug no one had ever gifted me, in a kitchen no one in my family had ever seen, waiting for a dinner I hadn't truly wanted to attend but had chosen to, for one final reason, for one final move, for one final shift in the hierarchy they had clung to for decades. Like an heirloom they refused to question. I had RSVP'd yes, not because I needed closure, and certainly not because I needed their presence, but because I wanted to see what truth looked like when served cold, surrounded by garland, forced into the shape of a celebration. When I arrived at my mother's house that evening, the driveway was already full, the porch lights glittering too brightly in that desperate suburban way that tries to signal happiness through wattage alone, and the sound of laughter spilled through the windows in that brittle, over-rehearsed cadence that tells you people are performing warmth rather than experiencing it. I stepped inside to the familiar scent of cinnamon candles and overcooked ham, removed my coat with the precision of someone preparing for battle disguised as dinner, and scanned the room for faces. My mother was in the kitchen, barking instructions over her shoulder while pretending not to notice me, and Travis was posted near the wine bar, holding a glass too tightly, his smile stretched thin over something that had clearly been unraveling since our last conversation. The living room had been decorated to the teeth, stockings embroidered with names, blinking lights on every surface, a tree so heavy with ornaments it looked like it might topple under the weight of decades of manufactured memory. But what drew everyone's eye, eventually, was the small pile of red envelopes stacked neatly on the edge of the dessert table, each one labeled in black ink. Addressed to every adult seated around that table, myself excluded. I didn't mention them. I didn't gesture toward them. I waited until dessert had been served, store-bought pie reheated, and passed off as homemade. And then, as forks scraped the bottom of ceramic plates, and my mother began thanking herself aloud for pulling everything together, I rose from my chair, walked slowly toward the table, and began handing out the envelopes one by one. They were all watching now. I returned to my seat, took a sip of wine, and waited. The first to open his envelope was my uncle, who let out a low whistle and passed the photograph to his wife before saying, "Did you know about this?" in a voice that didn't try to hide its admiration. One by one, the others followed, unfolding the high-quality matte finish photos that each revealed the same image from a different angle. Me standing in front of a freshly renovated two-story colonial, a sold sign in the foreground, and a caption handwritten at the bottom corner that simply read, December 4th. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she pulled the photo from the envelope with the kind of hesitation normally reserved for opening legal documents. And when she saw it, when she recognized the house, her childhood home, the one she had watched be sold at auction last year, after her cousin failed to make the payments, she froze. For a few seconds she didn't speak. She didn't look up. She just stared, her mouth slightly open, the corners of her lips twitching as if fighting off every question she'd never thought she'd need to ask me. "I didn't buy it to live in," I said calmly, my voice cutting through the room like a knife through frosting. "I bought it because no one else saw the value in it. Sound familiar?" Travis's face had gone red, though whether it was from the wine, the shame, or the fact that he knew I'd just removed the last plank from under his feet, I couldn't say. He looked at Sabrina, who sat stone still, the photo in her lap, her fingers curled tight around the edges. She hadn't said a word all evening, but now, as everyone began murmuring and piecing together the timeline, she stood slowly, picked up her purse, and walked toward the door. No dramatic exit, no scene, just a quiet leaving. Then Travis stood, his voice loud, too loud, cracking in places it hadn't cracked since he was a teenager, caught sneaking back home after midnight. "Okay," he said, raising his hands as if calling a courtroom to order. "Okay, fine. There's something I need to say." I looked at him and gave nothing, no nod, no encouragement, only silence. He shifted from one foot to the other, eyes darting across the room, gauging whether anyone was still in his corner. Then he spoke. It started small, little admissions wrapped in self-deprecating humor, nervous laughter as he described stretching the truth in pitch meetings, borrowing an address to make his company seem more established, forgetting to mention certain financial setbacks. He made eye contact with no one. His mother covered her mouth. His cousin shook his head. By the time he said the word fraud, no one laughed, not even him. When he finally sat back down, the room didn't applaud, it didn't sigh, it didn't even move. It just breathed, low, shocked, disbelieving. I waited another moment, then placed my napkin on my plate and stood. "Thanks for dinner," I said, the words weightless compared to everything that had just unfolded. "It's been enlightening." And then I walked out. The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the sidewalk in that soft, soundless way that makes everything feel like a secret. I got into my car, started the engine, and glanced once at the house I had grown up in, the one filled with performances and expectations and deeply conditional love, and felt nothing that resembled regret. Just distance, just peace. As I pulled away, my phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from my father, a man who had left when I was barely a teenager, who had sent sporadic postcards from cities he could barely spell, and who hadn't attended a family gathering in over 20 years. It said, "I saw the photos. You always had it in you. Just took them too long to notice." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Because the thing they never understood, the thing they'd buried under years of dismissiveness and condescension and misguided pride, was that I was never asking to be chosen. I was just waiting for the moment when I could choose, once and for all, to never need their invitation again.